Alright, so I am streaming. So, you saw the title. Yes, I am going to be, saying Mr. Beast, 10,000 times. It's gonna be epic. Let's see. Counter to 1,000. Or 10,000, I mean. That's not what I wanted. Hold on. Here. This is ridiculous. There are already a few people watching this. I don't know how they got there so fast, but okay. So counter space bar counter. Yeah, that's not what I wanted. Oh, you got, yeah, of course you did. Alright. So, yeah, we're gonna be saying Mr. Beast 1,000 times. Alright, I'm going to be starting in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Beast, oh. Alright. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Yes, 10,000, I mean, not 100. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah! Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh my god, it's so hard. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah! I'll say PewDiePie 5K times on my channel soon. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Can we get 2,000 subscribers? All right, just make sure you hit that subscribe button. All right, already at 100. Here I am. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast. Rest in peace, rest in love, rest in, okay, whatever. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah! It's so hard to say it. It's like Mr. Beast. 2 S's. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. The first time I make a cat on my desktop eat cat food than this. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Miss Wissis. Yeah, that's really what I sound like. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. It's hard saying it fast, alright? Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. We're already at 6 minutes. Beast. I'm obese. I'm obese. That's really what I sound like. Mr. Beast, 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 Mystery, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Alright, we're at 300. I'm kind of doing what Mr. Beast did to Logan Paul. Alright. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Curly million times. Yeah, I should do that. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Also, that would take ages. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah! Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, blah blah blah. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm saying Beast, 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 Mr. 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast, Beast, Beast. See, it counts, alright? Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. $400 times. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh my god. Give me your soul. Hello. Hi. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh, I went over 420. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Missy Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Ah! Oh my gosh, it's so hard saying this. Mr. Beast, 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 Mystery, Mr. Beast, 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 ah. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. Beast. All right. Mr. Beast, Beast, Beast. Mr. Beast, Beast, Beast. Mr. Beast, Beast, Beast. Misty Peace. Oh, I really like that. Mr. Misty, Beast, Beast, Beast. So counting that. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm not even close to being done. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I see you've done your project and stuff from before. Oh. What do you mean? I need to check Discord. You don't have a fetish on something. You have a fetish for something. Furry. Alright. Ignore his name, alright? 89% done. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, I need to send this. Hold on. Hold on. Where is it? There we go. Because half my friends haven't heard that I was streaming yet. So yeah, everyone. Alright, back on track. Sorry. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh my god. 10,000, alright? We're doing it to 10,000, not to 1,000 like myself saying I'm not a furry for 1,000 times. That took forever, right? That took like 2 hours just because of the more syllables and words. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Why is the chat offsetted? Why not? I honestly don't know. What do you mean? Mr. Beast, 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 669. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. 666 is no, I'm not Satanist. Sorry. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, you don't know who Mr. Beast is? How do you not know who Mr. Beast is? He's the guy who gave PewDiePie subscribers. Mr. Beast, 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 Mrs. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mrs. Beast, Mr. 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 Beast is amazing. Well, his reaction channel is okay, but Mr. Beast is his channel is the best. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. It's a higher end on Skippy. By the way, I'm going to be saying Skeppy, or actually no, ping spoofing. No, I should say 14 for 10,000 times. Yeah, 14. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Wait, I should say, actually, I should send this to video media. Yeah, there we go. Alright. Sorry. Bitch lasagna. Show. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh. I should say begging Mr. Beast to give PewDiePie more subscribers. Actually, I should say that. Actually, no, never mind. We're just not. Why is the emoji thing a thing? All I hear is a busy piece now. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh my gosh, it hurts just saying it a lot. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beats, Mr. Beats, Beast, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah, God. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast, 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 and Mr. Beast. That is 1,000 times in 22 minutes. So this stream will end in about 2 hours. Or 3 hours. I've done most of my homework. Thank God. Mr. Beast, 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 10% there. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. Beast, ah, Mr. Beast, 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 ah, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, one, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. All right, subscriber check. All right, 1 subscriber. An ugly. Okay. Okay. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I should have my live sub count on. I'll have a sub count check, or it could do that. It could ding. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Okay, here we go. Mr. Beast, 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 Mrs. Beast, Mrs. Beast, Mr. 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 Beast, and Mr. Beast. 12% there. I had to think about that. Yeah, I think that's 12%. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Here, I'm gonna change Mr. Beast, Beast, skip B. Alright. Oh my god. Where is it? Hold on. What happened to the chat? Oops. Dun 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 da 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 da. Reload. Show chat. Yeah, I'm trying to, alright? There we go. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beats, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beast, and Mr. Beast. Alright. So we have 44 minutes. Or till 44. Timmy Flakes. Where do you get Undertale from? Mr. Beast, 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 Timmy Flakes, Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Beats, Beast, Mr. Mitcher, Beast, 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beast, Misty Beats. That's really what it sounds like in my head too. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Why are you saying Timmy Flakes? Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Is there... Alright, Tim... Okay. Let's play, the actual song. Dun 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 dun. I don't know. Mr. Beast, 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 1666. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, 1669. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Let's just start advertising this. Alright, so some advertisements right here. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, sure. There. Boom. Here, how about we could just do my guild chat and do, general and just advertise my channel right there. Um, Aww. Raccoon Hotel. Let's see where. Alright, fine, I'll continue. Alright, I'll have to scream out Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast! Oh. Mr. Beast! Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm making fucking mac and cheese, and nobody can stop me. I need to show that clip. I really like me. I'm making fucking mac and cheese, and nobody can stop me. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I like the Delta Ring meme better. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Z, Mr. Beast, 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 as Mr. Beast. All right, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Don't swear. Whatever. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Fine, I will not swear. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. If you don't like it, just don't swear. It's simple. Mr. Beast, 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 and Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mystery Meat. Alright, so 20% there. Oh, my throat hurts already. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Wait, really? He just did? Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Hey, I gotta check that. No, 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 no. Okay, on my iPad. Mr. Beast just uploaded a video. That's my stream. Let's see. He did! He donated $10,000 to PewDiePie. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh my god, thank you! You should be highly promoted if I get views. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I wish I had stream donations on. That would have been epic, but whatever. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Yeah, maybe actually. I don't know. It's sad that I don't have donations. I mean, I wish I had, but the thing is, I don't want donations. A thing with donation is, they don't really... Some money can be fake, acts, and then I take the blame, and then my information can get leaked, so that's probably why I don't have, donations, or that is why I don't have donations. But once my channel grows to, like, about, I don't know, MLG Fox was just donated $100,000. Very clever, but no. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 2.3, 20. 23%. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. True. Yeah, I think I'll get in 160 minutes, maybe 2 hours. I don't know. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. All right. 24%. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I want to get a shout out from Mr. Beast. I don't care about the money. I just want to get that shout out. And I say, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Can we get 100,000 subscribers? Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Why not? Mr. Beast, 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 25%. Mr. Beast. Alright, you're a subscriber here. Mr. Beast! Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Yeah, I'm gonna promote you for doing that because you're a brave soldier. You deserve to be a moderator now. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, also, that will be like the last moderator I'm promoting, alright? I'm sorry, but I have too many moderators. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh my God. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. It was suggested. Oh, nice. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. That's a good sign. Yeah. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, my channel, for more quality content like this. I'll say Skeppy after this, and then yeah, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 27%. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Imagine if it goes on trending. Let's go trending. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 28%. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I was here when you had a crap ton of homework. Yeah, I had that shit ton of homework. Sorry. No, okay. I swore. I had that lots of homework. And yeah. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, oh. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh, also, I still have a crap ton of homework. I'm kind of done. I finished all here, but yeah. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Everyone spam Timmy Flick in the chat. I don't know why I said that. Just spam it. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Andrew Huss. Same name. My name is Andrew. And why you said no? Why though? Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Why not? Mr. Beast, 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 what? Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, Mr. Beast. I have a great idea. So we should do like watching the Texas A&M versus LSU game, because that game is like overtime 7 and it's like 5 hours long with the ads. So we should, yeah, it'll be quality content. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast! Yeah! 30%. Oh. I need water. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I don't have Twitter, sadly. I should send that. I should get it like a Twitter account. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Ah, Mr. Beast. Ah, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 31%. Mr. Beast, 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 32%, Mr. Beast, 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 and Mr. Beast. 33%. 33%. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 3333. Rip. I lost a subscriber. Oh. I'm back to where I currently was before. Basically 1/3. Yeah. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 stop. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. You know what? I'm turning off the subscriber count. That's a little bit too distracting. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 34%. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh. 35%. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Make a beat whenever you make a space, sorry. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beats, Beast, 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 Mr. 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 Beast, Misty Beast, Mr. 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 Yeet, Yeet, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh my god. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beast, Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Oh my god. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. That's 10. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm gonna get some water once I hit 4,000. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Okay. 4,000th time. I'm getting a drink of water. Alright, next water break will be at 8,000. Aww, people hate me. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Well, people do. 3 dislikes? Come on. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh, I'm doing this for the views. Yeah, whatever. No. Just kidding, you got pranked. I don't know why I'm doing this. Because I said I wasn't a furry for 2,000 times. And yeah, I want to continue the series. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 and why not? Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Only for the views. Not really, but still. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I am not was it rice gum? I am not rice gum. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Hey, I'm not clickbaiting you, alright? I'm getting to it. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Hey, I've been a subscriber to Mr. Beast since he had like 300,000 subscribers. It was in like 2015. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Yeah, that's about right. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm not Russian. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I can speak some Spanish and some Czech, but no, not Russian. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. You don't need to go to sleep. It's 3:44. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ah, my head hurts. I'm so tired of saying Mr. Beast, and I'm gonna. Oh, no. No. Once I said that, I was like, oh, okay, I kind of effed up. Alright, I know some Spanish, just no. And, yeah. No, not to, no. No. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. What does this say? Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I literally have my state on it. Oops. I shouldn't have read that. It is interesting. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, you can't see it. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I can't see your t-shirt. It says Texas A&M. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh, well, you should know that I live around Texas. Alright. I'm not really gonna leak any information. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I can understand, yeah. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I'm already dying on the inside. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Heap, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Hey! Ah! I'm dying already. Ah. Halfway there. Mr. Beast, 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 bye, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I have like a headache. Oh, alright. Make sure you subscribe for good luck and cheer me on. Because I'm dying here. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Hey, that was actually pretty fast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Alright, well, yeah. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Ugh. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Oh, hold on. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm looking at Mr. Beast's channel right now. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. This is called multitasking. Tasking. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh my gosh, I'm spitting everywhere. Mr. Beast, 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 what Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mr. Beast, 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 Beats, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, 14 watching, that's high. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Yeah, I wonder that too. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Is this trending or not? Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, or is this trending yet? Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Oh, I forgot. Mr. Beast, 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 Mystery Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I wonder if this pops up whenever I search up Mr. Beast. It does! Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, thanks for subbing. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Beast. Hey, all of you have to sub if I make it to 10,000. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. We're at 7,000. I looked at my at who I subscribe to, the videos they posted. And yeah, thank you for subscribing. Really, thank you for all this the 1,000 subscribers. And yeah. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, yeah. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Now I actually feel the pain that Mr. Beast and Skeppy has been through. It's my throat hurts so badly. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. See, it just takes some practice on saying Mr. Beast. See, now I'm saying a little bit more fluently. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Once I reach 10,000 subscribers, guys, you are legally allowed to subscribe. Or no, 10,000 times, I mean, not subscribers, legally. That ain't gonna happen if... Alright, Mr. Beast, 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 just read my Beast, Mr. 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 Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Oh my god, this is so hard. My throat's starting to hurt. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Ah. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 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 Mr. Beast. Ah! Oh, my tongue hurt. Ah! Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, okay. 80% of a way. Ah, I told you my next break was at 8,000. Oh! That could have gone way worse than what just happened. Aw, I spilled water. I forgot there was still water in here. Aw. I must complete this journey to 10,000. We spill water on ourselves, but that's okay. I will work through it. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'll be done in about an hour. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 85%! We are so close to done. I'm ready to get out. I am so dumb. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I complete if I have the time to do this. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 not Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Oh. Oops. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. What went wrong in your life to feel the need to do this? I don't know. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I stopped gaining subscribers there. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, and I'm depressed in school, alright? Just kidding. I'm not. I have a lot of schoolwork. Well, I finished all of it. I don't know. And this is what I do on my free time. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 90%. We, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. There's 5, so that it is fair. Like, I actually made 9,000 times. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Hello, welcome back. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 and Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 95%. Let's go. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, I'm starting to not get fluent. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Oh, I'm losing viewers. No. I mean, everyone grows tired of this. I can't blame them. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. On my iPad it says 8 watching. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Yes. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Why not? Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. It's Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Hey, Mr. Beast did it. Mr. Beast did it. So Logan Paul. Skeppy did it. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I'm not gonna say it. I have to know you before I can say it. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. I'm not sure if that works, but whatever. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Let's go, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. 9,999. Oh, you're legally allowed to subscribe once I hit 10,000. Mr. Beast. Subscribe! Come on! Hey. Alright, I'm gonna say it five times so it's legit. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. So that means it's legit. Make sure you have to subscribe, man. You have to. If your name starts with S, is gay. Oh! I just noticed that. Wait, why am I even looking right here? I went to close it on my iPad. We did it. 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 Oh my god. And all the viewers just came right whenever I hit the 10,000. Please subscribe. I said it. You're legally allowed to subscribe to me now, since I said Mr. Beast 10,000 times. You're legally allowed to subscribe. Come on. I'm gonna keep on spamming this subscribe. Yeah, what a lovely... Okay, I think I broke it. Oh. Well, other people aren't. Okay, I will chill. Alright, it is a big moment, alright? It's been 3 hours. No, 2.5 hours. I have to get recognition from Mr. Beast, alright? Jeez. That was intense. The end. Oh, alright. Make sure you subscribe. Subscribe in 3 seconds for good luck. And yeah, I stole that quote from Skeppy. Subscribe to Mr. Beast. And make sure you tweet this out to Mr. Beast, please. I would really appreciate it. I don't have Twitter. And I'm too lazy to get it. Thank you, Shadow. Alright, I'll have to end the stream in here. I am dead in the inside, or yeah, dead in the inside for doing this. So, yeah. See ya in the next stream. Hey, I said I was gonna do it, alright? Let's see, we're not gonna do that. What was it? Streams. Sing. I know my viewers waited so long for this. So long. Alright. See ya. Peace out. Goodbye.